I'm Maitrayee Basu, and I'm a PhD student in the media department here at Middlesex University. So today's panel, Historicizing Gendered Media Production from Fan Cultures to Feminisms, I think has a really interesting focus on the kind of history of gendered production and co-producers, etc. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your talks. The first one up is Diana Anselmo-Sequeira from the University of California-Irvine. Diana holds a PhD in visual studies from the University of California-Irvine and will be a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pittsburgh in 2015. Her dissertation examines the fan practices and personal archives of the first generation of American girls who grew up with the movies. And she will be presenting on crafting a sense of self in the age of mechanical production, movie-going girls as media producers, 1911 to 1992. I don't think this is one of yours, is it now? Let me just put yours up.
That is mine.
That's right? Okay. Okay. I'll switch.
Okay. For over a century, two misconceptions have plagued the popular understanding of young female audiences. One, that girls are foremost consumers, not producers of media. And two, that girls' attachment to mass culture is undiscerning, compulsive, borderlining on the pathological. Through an analysis of signed letters, collages, and drawings crafted by movie-going girls during the 1910s, I aim to show that contrary to derogatory depictions of girl fandom disseminated in the American press, the first generation of white young female spectators who came of age in the United States acted as creative cultural appropriators, discerning film critics, and methodical media archivists. In this way, my paper also sheds light on the origins of organized girl fandoms and youth media subcultures. I must note, though, that this paper is a sliver of a much larger book project. So the main goal here today is not to be comprehensive, but to share with you unpublished ideas and artifacts, most of the artifacts that have been retrieved from online bidding sites like eBay and private collections. So in 1910, the American film industry began relying on individual actors to achieve large box office revenues. This business model was called the star system. All at the same time, a new type of film spectator gained visibility. Presented as a white, young, unmarried female whose love for the movies knew no bounds, the screen-struck girl became one of the most popular... Oh wait, I'm having trouble with... Okay. Aha. Okay, there. The screen-struck girl became one of the most popular and most enduring representations of film fandom in American culture. In 1918, the trade newspaper Photography offered an apt description of the screen-struck girl figure. Quote, "She believes she's a great actress, indulges in various temperamental whims, and her rude awakening is funny." End of quote. Defined by delusional self-importance, emotional instability, and a laughable lack of grasp on reality, the screen-struck girl figure is the ancestor of our contemporary quote-unquote fangirl, typically found outside a Twilight film premiere or a One Direction concert, waving handmade collages, screaming, devoid of any emotional control or rational discernment. And here you have images of that popular imagery of the fangirl that we see today. The screen-struck girl figure crucially captures the American film industry's ambiguous response to the rise of young female audiences. On one hand, the industry recognized that girl fans importantly contributed to the success of the American star system. On the other hand, though, the film industry struggled to limit girls' labor, agency, and cultural significance with figures such as the screen-struck girl. Although film magazines depicted movie-loving girls as homogeneous daydreamers that could not distinguish reality from screen fantasy, in the privacy of their homes and in the company of their peers, girl fans expressed their effective investment in the pictures in autonomous and discerning ways. In fact, white girls from all walks of life subverted traditional practices associated with conservative womanhood and female domesticity, such as collaging, hand painting, journaling, letter writing, and scrapbooking as means to articulate professional aspirations, alternative identities, and erotic desires that did not find acceptable expression in everyday life. For instance, movie-loving girls used epistolary conventions to reach out to beloved actresses and express their aspirations of becoming film players. In 1910s, American society deemed acting an unsuitable occupation for respectable, unmarried girls, not too unlike what we were hearing from Mary Celeste's work earlier on. Quote, the stage presents an accountable attraction for the silly young girl who, flattered by relatives and friends, conceives the idea that she has talent. This entails the needed sacrifice of womanhood. Girls, are you sure you want to be a total failure as an actress and as a woman? A New York newspaper warned in 1910. Yet when writing to movie star Florence Lawrence, girls rooted their acting aspirations not in delusional vanity or self-destructive obsession, but in the pursuit for professional advancement and financial stability. For instance, in May 1911, Rose Hort from Baltimore, a young girl, penned a letter to Florence Lawrence simply inquiring about, quote, the salary a beginner gets and how to find a position of the acting kind, end of quote. In November, Jean Martin from Ohio, quote, took the liberty of writing to Lawrence for advice due to her much interest in picture posing. Do companies sometimes take a performer who is inexperienced and let them work up? The 18-year-old inquired businesslike. Aware of the prejudice surrounding the acting occupation, Theodora Anthony of Rhode Island wrote to Lawrence not seeking counsel, but a complicit ear. The 20-year-old confessed that, quote, she had always cherished hopes of being an actress, but my people won't consider it for a moment. I know it is work and that many do not succeed, Theodora continued sensibly, but I'm determined I shall, because I'm not afraid to try. Again, that idea that Corinne was talking about of women having a different fear of failure, Theodora didn't. She was ready for it. In addition to using epistolary conventions to retrieve professional advice directly from an established source, girl fans also employed new visual technologies to actualize their aspired identities. Photography played a key role in girls' self-presentation. They mailed black and white Kodaks with their fan letters as a way to communicate their photogenic attributes and desired screen personae. For example, submitting a trimmed headshot that resembles an industrial die cut, Theodora sports a chic bob that refers to the emerging flapper look. Here she is. Rose Hort from Baltimore sent Florence Lawrence a classic studio portrait, her Gibson girl-esque updo and white frilly dress, signaling the girl's conservative personality. Whoa, this is crazy. All right, this was an image of Viola Dana, a very popular actress at the time with the flapper cut. She was a flapper girl. I do not know why this happened, but it looks like abstract art. So there, yep, there you go. Okay, Rose Hort that sent a classic studio portrait with her Gibson girl-esque up hairdo and white frilly dress, signaling the girl's conservative personality, but also drawing attention to her resemblance to the ingenue starlets crowding the American screen in the 1910s. Let's see if this does the same. So this is the Gibson girl, a drawing from 1909. There you go. As you see her referring it in the hair. And this is actually Florence Lawrence, who she was writing to, who was a megastar in 1910. So as you see, she's drawing inspiration from both of these conservative imagery of femininity in the early 20th century. If Theodora and Rose's photos presented well-to-do would-be actresses, Jean's grainy, manually cropped Kodak suggests that the girl may not have had the financial means to get headshots professionally taken. Her image shows a dark-haired girl dressed in an ill-fitting dress, her blurry features hopeful but indistinct due to the photo's poor quality. Although class permeates these girls' photographic calling cards, it is important to note that none of them chose to represent themselves as flighty or desperate screen-struck girls. Their demeanors are above all decorous, winsome, and humble, as are their letters to the revered movie star. In tandem with offering a new venue for girls to negotiate dreams of professional advancement and individual accomplishment, cinema played the central role in the leisure practices and peer activities of middle and upper class girls. Journal entries penned by a 15-year-old girl boarded at the Portland Academy in Oregon shows that movie-going was a fun social experience, not an exercise on self-absorption or madness. On September 1914, Medora wrote on her journal that, quote, "In the afternoon, Mary Kay, Elizabeth, and I went downtown, did some shopping, and then went to see the Virginian at the Peoples with Dustin Farnham as Steve. The scenery was the best part," end of quote. The following month, she penned, "After Jim, Ellen Mayo, Mary Woodward, and I went to see The Patchwork Girl of Oz at the Peoples, and it was very good. I bust my purse, but I would do it again," end of quote. Later in the year, Medora confesses again to skipping gym class for a trip to the movies, while keenly observing a fabricated change in Theda Bara's picture personality. Quote, "I didn't go to the gym, so Marge, Betty, Lois, Mary, and I went to see Theda Bara and the Galley Slave. She doesn't play the part of the vampire in this." Further, cinema did not just stimulate Medora's critical eye and peer bonding, but it also exercised her record-keeping abilities. From 1914 to 15, the schoolgirl kept detailed records of how much her movie-going pastime cost her. This practice was popular amongst young female spectators from all social origins, further evincing that many girl fans were not inherently spendthrift and irresponsible as suggested in the film press, but were rather frugal and mindful patrons. You might not be able to see it very well, but in that, like the third and fourth up from the bottom says how much it cost her, like the car fare and the tickets, so you can see it that she itemizes everything. Moreover, far from merely consumeristic, girls' fan attachment to cinema was creative, collaborative, and productive, as evidenced by collages girls crafted of their favorite stars. In 1914, for example, Edna, a 15-year-old girl from Chicago, dedicated such a paper shrine to one of her idols, 16-year-old Ella Hall. The two-page collage, gingerly assembling a photo for each of the young actresses' screen roles, functions as a well-curated visual resume, chronicling Ella's short movie career. More than a decorative compendium, Edna's assemblage of film ephemera gives new life to the disposable pieces of mass-produced paper, reappropriating them into a one-of-a-kind multimedia artifact, the movie scrapbook. Edna proudly dubs the 6 handcrafted volumes the Motion Picture Pictorial. Naming her scrapbook suggests that these were always imagined as utilitarian visual archives, a fan-made film encyclopedia, and thus an autonomous media artifact. Another example of girls appropriating collage, decoupage, and photomontage as means to create new media objects can be found in Margaret's movie scrapbook. Compiled in Missouri, here it is, between 1915 and 16, this quote-unquote picture book, that's how she named it, includes many pages dedicated to young actresses like Lillian Gish, Mary Pickford, and Margaret Clark. Margaret, the fan, amasses an impressive array of film ephemera, from autographed headshots to commercial photo postcards, traded fan clippings, and even handwritten letters from the stars. And the one you're seeing on that corner is from Margaret Clark, who she loved. Girls' fan drawings, penned in their movie scrapbooks and personal diaries, also revealed that young female audiences were quite capable of distinguishing between reality and screen fancy. In fact, they did so with humor, as revealed in a cartoon drawn by a 19-year-old California girl. Constance inked this drawing in 1918 when negotiating an unrequited crush on a high school colleague who went to become a marginal film actor in New York City. The drawing reveals Constance's sober understanding that her desired happy ending could only exist in the world of cinematic make-believe. Likewise, Edna penciled in small hand-drawn inserts around actors' print images. Drawings of a hand-colored black and red little ladybug are incorporated in collages dedicated to Screen's heartthrob Crane Wilbur. And I'm sorry I don't have images for that, but take it to the Margaret Herrick, because they're very, very protective of you taking any kind of images of ephemeral materials. Other times, a stamped image of an impish Cupid appears next to Wilbur's image. Edna hand-painted the Cupid's tiny body, makeshifting bright-colored wings and horns. The cherub further resembles a mascot of Wilbur's Chocolate Buds. In 1914, the Philadelphia Candy Company illustrated their products with a Cupid stirring a cup of hot cocoa. Edna adorned many Wilbur's collages with Wilbur Chocolate buds tags, likely a reference to the leading man's surname as well as to the fan being sweet on the film player. Drawing is one of the many handcrafts girls employ to articulate budding erotic desire. Other practices included letters to equally enthusiastic, moving, loving girlfriends. In a note, for example, Floss advises Edna to curb her passion for Wilbur, an investment that had by then taken over the schoolgirl's sleeping and waking life. Quote, talk about dreams. Well, I never saw one that came up to that Crane one. Now keep cool when you write him a letter, and if you tell him beforehand that, when you catch him, why, the wary fellow will surely keep out of your tracks. Fair warning, darling. End of quote. Floss concluded by humorously stating that Wilbur, quote, is sure getting you in a pickle now with that hammering business, a reference to Edna hurting her finger while trying to nail an image of the actor above her bed, in itself an intimate place for worshipping film stars as to rehearse romantic crushes. In some, since the late 1900s, that white girls in their teens from various social backgrounds have appropriated film femme culture to form peer bonds and girls-only communities that help individual female spectators negotiate their coming-of-age process. Thus, I propose that organized media girl culture appeared in the US earlier than suggested by most historians, namely Paula Flass and Kelly Schrum, who placed the emergence of a distinct teen culture in the late 1920s. In fact, spurred by the birth of narrative cinema, moving-loving girls began acting as creative cultural agents before World War I, bringing together mass-produced film ephemera with traditional handcrafts to produce original and uniquely personal media artifacts. Ultimately, this marriage of manual work and new visual technology allowed film consumption to expand beyond the ephemeral consumptive act of movie watching, branching out into a platform for creating durable and one-of-a-kind fan-curated media archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for most of all keeping within time. So I'd like to call Anna Bryant again. She's from the Kairos Communications at Maynooth University. And she is in the Department of Media Studies in Maynooth University as a coordinator on their broadcast production degree. She has published in the areas of community, media, politics, media and gender, and creative labor and gender. And today she'll be presenting on Hear Hoofbeats, Think Zebras, Women's Leadership in Changing Pre-Feminist Media Labor Force in Late 1970s Ireland.
She always uses Mac, so she can't see.
Oh, that's all right. If you just click on.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And where's your... Okay, so I guess this paper talks a lot to the material that Mary Celeste was speaking about earlier for young women, how difficult it is for them to get into media, how difficult it is for them to even survive at university level, to get entry-level roles, and to survive within the context of an industry that is somewhat hostile to them. And I guess a lot of my research work looks at those questions. Why do women leave media work? In what way is television production gendered? How are the roles and the routines and the culture of media, screen production industries gendered? And then I thought, well, you know, we probably, in striving to make all these changes, need to be very conscious that we're coming from an era when it was probably even worse for women and more difficult to enter media and to gain careers there and to sustain them. And so I became very interested in looking at how did women in the past achieve what we've achieved thus far. What mechanisms did they use to enter into media and to sustain careers therein? And so I looked at a bunch of women that were writing in Ireland in the 1970s and became interested in how they had worked. So I'm looking at the three different ways in which media work can be gendered, and just used that as kind of a skeleton frame to look at their work and their engagement in print journalism back in the 70s. So as a lot of the literature on production studies and women in media elaborates, one of the ways in which gendered identity is intrinsically linked to labour practices is through the allocation of roles within a production process. And that was very much true for women in the 70s. There were limited opportunities for women to enter. I spoke with 3 women journalists who were particularly of interest in that era. each of them called Mary, which says a lot about Ireland at that time. There was Mary Marr, who worked for the Irish Times, the national daily newspaper, Mary Kenny, who worked for the Irish Press, and Mary McCutcheon, who worked for the Irish Independent. So 3 national newspapers, 3 Marys, each of them the editors of the women's pages of the newspapers. And each of them friends with each other as well, because as those of you who are going to Consoling Passions next week will figure out, or this week will figure out, it's quite a small city. So this was their habitat and this is where they lived. So I did a lot of research, just looking at kind of primary published sources on them and communication with some of them as well. And this is how they described their engagements with the print industry at the time. They said, yeah, there was limited, the practice, the process of journalism was gendered for them in that, and in a particular way, in that the role of journalist was a little bit risque for them at the time. So Mary Kenny said, it certainly wouldn't have been mentioned at my convent school as a career choice. And I thought that resonated a bit with what Mary was describing earlier about guidance counsellors discouraging young women from entering film. Back in the 70s, that was the same for journalism. So they thought, so you could not be a sub-editor, you couldn't be a typesetter, a compositor. It was just an accepted convention. It wasn't that there was any hard and fast rule. It was just that the kind of culture and the barrier of male prejudice mitigated against you having those roles. So women were excluded from the role of journalism. It just simply wasn't kind of thought that they should occupy that role. Another way in which they were excluded from it was the recruitment process for journalism at the time was very, very informal. A little bit like film now, where you're heavily dependent on networks to engage and to get you that first job. It was the same for journalism in the 70s. And the women would often go and hang out in certain pubs in Dublin and in that way get commissions to write. So the recruitment was either through family and friendship networks or through the informal space of the pub. And I suppose in this paper I'm trying to document the ways in which it was difficult for the women to enter, but also, how did they crack that nut? How did they actually end up in there as the women's editors? And of course the answer lies with a commercial rationale for them. Basically in 1967, Donald Foley, who was the news editor of the Irish Times, knew that women's liberation was kind of an up-and-coming topic, knew that it would sell papers, and that having young feminist women editing the women's pages of his newspaper was going to be a very obvious asset to him. And so he spent a lot of time recruiting women to write for the paper. And there was one woman in particular, Mary Marr, who had come to him from the Chicago Tribune. And he actually took a bit of time to talk her into it, because up to the late 60s, the women pages were all about recipes and knitting, quite traditional preoccupations. And he wanted to do something different with it. And she at first didn't get what he was talking about, but once he assured her that it could be something that would have serious article, scathing social attacks, biting satire, she was in, and Women First became her domain. She describes her appointment as an incitement to insurrection, which I think is a nice motto for anybody to have. And that's how she describes getting that job with Foley. So some supportive feminist men even back in the 70s in Ireland. And the two, once she was in there in the Times, then the other 2 national dailies followed suit. So even though the role of journalist was very gendered and women weren't particularly encouraged into it, and there were informal barriers to recruitment, yet there they were, these 3 young women in the national dailies with basically maybe 2.5 pages of copy a day to cover issues of their choice and of their selection. However, being a journalist for women still created a bit of a role dissonance for them. In the 70s in Ireland, women had to accommodate that sometimes problematic conflict between being a woman and what that meant in the 1970s and also being a journalist. So in other words, still the same things that come up and are still live today, that women were expected to be communal, to be kind, to be concerned for others and have warmth and gentleness about them, while men were permitted to be more agentic and more confident and aggressive. But Kenny speaks then to that whole idea. She said, that they really felt they had to walk that tightrope between acceptability as workers and condemnation as women. So she documents that in the 70s as a live issue. She said they could be dismissed so easily as being hysterical or truculent if they kind of got in the way of anybody else in the office. and women were dismissed as being unstable or frustrated or menopausal on the slightest whim. I suppose the funny thing about this discourse is if you look to see where it's going on, it's actually in the papers. So the women straight away start writing about stuff that's very, very different. So in the 70s in Ireland, up to this point, the women's pages only had the knitting, the recipes, the kind of domestic level stuff. These women went in and straight away started talking about themselves as journalists and the barriers they faced in print in the papers. But they also started to talk about very controversial issues, such as unmarried mothers, deserted wives, equal pay, contraception. They went straight for the jugular on the topics that they covered, and they cover them from an explicitly feminist viewpoint. So from very early on in their work, the feminist subjectivity became both a unifying force amongst them and the subject matter of what they were doing, and a bit of a protection against a lot of the kind of harshness of the climate that they were working in. And they were working in a climate that was quite hostile to them. So I think we can, although it's difficult for women now to access media work, even back then it was even worse, certainly in an Irish context. In the 70s in Ireland, 96% of women worked unpaid in the home. So only 4% of women comprised the workforce, is the flip of that statistic. Nell McCafferty, quite a famous Irish journalist at that time who wrote a lot on Northern Ireland and also wrote for the women's pages, working for Mary Marr, commented that wives who had paid work constituted a mere 9% of the female labour force. In that regard, most of our little group were freaks, married with children and with jobs to boot. At this time in Ireland there was a marriage bar that was informally imposed, so that once women got married they would have to leave their jobs. That was the law in the case of civil service jobs and banking jobs for some reason, and teaching as well, I think. But it was mapped onto all sorts of other work areas informally, and it just became the rule that once you got married you left your job. Now funnily, when you left your job you were often rehired back into it, but on a temporary contract with less pay and conditions, less better terms than you had previously had. So if you got married on a Saturday and came back to work the following Monday, you were on a different salary scale, different holiday rates, and just whole different, and no scope for promotion. So there was a huge cultural piece in there. So this was the context in which women occupied the role of journalism, and they kind of bravely pushed at the boundaries of that. And they really had a great time. You know, these three would, once they were in the newspapers, very shortly afterwards in 1970, they set up the Irish Women's Liberation Movement with maybe 5 or 6 other women, and they became activists in an Irish context, changing massively. They had a huge impact nationally. They changed the whole convention around the use of contraception, around attitudes towards domestic violence, towards unmarried mothers. They had a huge impact. And part of that impact came from their role as journalists, which they struggled to get into, but once they got in, they really occupied it and had a great old time doing it. So it was a bit risque, but they had a great deal of fun at the same time, which is worth remembering too, and it's all doom and gloom otherwise. Because of, with less women entering the industry though, so there were fewer of them, the Irish Times at one point had a 50-50 gender balance in the newspaper. They had as many women writing as men, which in 1970 was quite phenomenal. The other two papers less so, there were less women there, and they were only really allowed into the role of journalists. They couldn't be sub-editors. There was only one female photographer that I can find in that whole era working in the paper. And so with fewer of them coming in, there was fewer of them in that pipeline into senior decision-making roles. So that impacted on them in lots of different ways. Editorial jobs that would have allowed them to charge overtime were excluded to them. And there was that, again, that tension between, as leaders then, they had that tension between the agentic qualities that were expected of them as editors of the pages. So these women weren't simply journalists writing for the pages, they were the editors of the pages. So they actually had kind of senior decision-making roles, if you want to think of those editorial jobs in that way. And when I knew this piece of work from Eagly on feminist leadership, and I just thought it was interesting that the women themselves would document how much they had to tread that line very carefully between being the boss but also not overstepping the kind of very gendered expectations of them. So Kenny expresses it quite well, again, in print, in the paper. She's having these discussions in the national newspapers. It's the old story. Women can get into journalism all right, but to get ahead, they just have to be much, much better. That's nothing remarkable. Plus ça change. Women know perfectly well that only 5% of the whole sex can succeed at anything in their own right, and that's how it is. And that speaks, again, to contemporary data around how much women are disproportionately punished if we make mistakes, ergo the perfectionism that Mary was talking about as well. We kind of nearly have to get it perfect because women are punished more heavily, 3 times more heavily if they mess up than the equivalent man in the same role. And they also have to work harder to get into the role to begin with. It was interesting, so that was how they occupied the role of journalist. It was interesting that even Mary Marr, once she got married, resigned her post. And this was the woman who founded the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, who ran a train from Dublin to Belfast to buy contraceptives in defiance of the customs and changed the whole law subsequently on contraception in Ireland, as well as making huge shifts culturally through the newspaper in attitudes towards unmarried mothers, as I've said, and other social issues. But she says, she holds her hands up and says, I just thought it was completely reasonable at the time that as soon as I got married I would resign my editorship of the paper. So I guess that's that section of looking at how they inhabited the role of journalist documents the fact that they faced a lot of the barriers we still see today, but they did triumph to some extent in that they occupied the role of journalist. They became editors, so had leadership roles. They certainly brought on lots of other women journalists who worked for them, so there was a lot of collegiality and mentorship in that. And yet, at the same time, they faced a lot of the barriers that we still see as relevant today. I guess where it all gets a little bit more optimistic is when you look at the second, so that's the roles and how they're occupied and how that gender works. The second piece is looking at the practice of journalism and how they shaped that as women. Usually that's shaped in 3 different ways. I think that media work is gendered in that the assignments can be allocated on quite a gendered basis. Women may get to do a lot more of the fluff and men get to do the serious, hard politics and economic stuff. The angles or the perspective that's applied to stories can be quite gendered in that men will often apply that very public lens to things and that expert lens to things in ways that women will speak more of a subjective or personal or private sphere experience. And they experience the dynamics of teamwork a little differently. I guess this was the more positive end of the experience for women. Their view of life was something that was new. I guess they brought the new journalism to Ireland in that they started to talk about subjective reality rather than the external happenings of the day. And they talked about them for and from a women's perspective, point of view. Mara speaks there in the testimony to the sorts of issues that they wrote about, that these had not been written about previously. Now they're just so taken for granted. But this was new, this was a departure in speaking about these things, and not just speaking about them in the abstract, but actually allowing women's voices to speak on them. And I like the fact that they leavened the polemics with a good deal of saucy and light-hearted personal comment. They were able again to have some fun with it all and to push the boundaries through that kind of use of humour and innuendo as well. So they began, I suppose, what's now become women's confessional journalism, which can be a bit problematic in its own way. But at the time, they were bringing stories out into the open that needed to be told and documented a lot of suffering. And so by the time the women's liberation, and this is where they hooked in with the activism idea, it was the same 3 women who were editing the pages with maybe 5 or 6 others, some of whom also worked in media, who started the Irish Women's Liberation Movement in the autumn of 1970. And they literally used the pages of the newspaper as a forum for their campaigns. So it was a bit of a reverse engineering thing. It wasn't that the activists accessed the media, it was that the media workers were already there and became the activists. And they would write on issues that were relevant to the women's liberation movement on practically a weekly basis. So feminism and activism and women's liberation became a staple of Irish media content during that time period, which was a new departure. But they still held onto their sort of journalistic bent in that they weren't giving a scoop to any of each other at the same time. Okay, so that just gives you a bit of a flavour for how they occupy the role of journalists a little bit differently, how they brought new angles, new story topics, new issues out into the open to be discussed, and went so far in that as to be explicitly feminist in their approach to it. They were a bit, the work culture then, which is the third category I look at them under, so roles, the practice, and the culture of the media industry at the time. A lot of them were a bit ambivalent about what culture it was they were in. You know, a lot of them didn't feel discriminated against, they felt quite privileged. Mary Marr said she was treated better at the Times than she had been back in Chicago, and saw the marriage bar as perfectly reasonable. So they weren't entirely, you know, even for women who were so activist, they were still not entirely aware of the kind of gendered dynamics of the work that they were in. But I think, I suppose, just to sum up, because I've run out of time, I suppose what I'm interested in looking at is how I think it's important to take those lessons from the past and to look at how women have faced the challenges of getting entry-level jobs, of occupying the roles, of getting the promotion to the senior decision-making roles. It has been done in the past. Women have brought new angles, new vision, new content and issues to bear and out into the open for discussion. They did it in the 70s while also being explicitly feminist activists. And so I suppose it is interesting to think how they used that subjectivity of being a feminist as a bulwark against a lot of the gendering of the work that they were doing, but also turned it into a virtue. It became literally the subject matter that they wrote about as well.
Thank you, Anne. So the next is Hedda Malari. Hedda defended her PhD in New Feminism, Gender Equality and Neoliberalism in Swedish girl films, 1995 to 2006 in January 2015. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And a book based on Malari's thesis, Swedish Girl Films, will be published in 2016 by Intellect. Again, congratulations. Her research interests include feminist historiography, cultural history, girlhood studies, film studies, and feminist media studies. And today she'll be presenting on historiography of mediated feminism, the case of Swedish Fittstim-feminism. Did I say it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's that.
Yeah, and how do I?
It's just this.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, hello and nice to see you all here. Thanks for coming. It's been a really inspirational and a good day. And it's such a nice opportunity to present in this panel about the Swedish feminist movement of the late 1990s and the turn of the millennium. I also want to lift up some viewpoints about how we read this movement today as part of feminist history. In my abstract, I mentioned the book called Fittstim and also a documentary film called Fittstim of Dagens Feminism, but I decided to only talk about the book today since we only have 15 minutes, so I won't talk too much and get over time. So my background is in cultural history and girlhood studies, also in teen film studies, and as a result of combining these three research fields, I've been especially interested in genealogies of girlhood and the feminist movement, how certain kinds of feminist girlhoods become possible in a certain historical context, and why, and who gets to define what these girlhoods and feminists are like. As said in the introduction, my thesis it dealt with a phenomenon I have named Swedish girl films. In other words, a film group of 19 films that focused on girls and young women from a feminist perspective, and that were often also connected to the Swedish gender egalitarian state feminism and media education. So many of these films had a really strong educational perspective in them as well. My main interest in my PhD was on how these films were framed in the contemporary press debate about girls and feminisms. So I studied several other sources, including girls' magazines, feminist magazines and journals, feminist guidebooks, US teen films, and media educational materials. So this vast network of research materials, it formed kind of a mediated network that made meaning of girls and feminisms at a certain historical, social, cultural, and political context. Moving on to the book in question. The book, or as I would say, a book phenomenon called Fittstim, was one significant part of the Swedish media feminist movement of the 1990s. This book is also quite exceptional since it was one of the only Swedish feminist cultural texts that I got introduced to already in my teens and in my young 20s. This book and the film over there, Lucas Moodysson's film called Fucking Åmål, which is a story about two teen girls who fall in love in the tiny Swedish city or town of Åmål. They were the ones that reached all the way across the Gulf to Finland. And in my case, even to a girl who is a native Finnish speaker and had only learned Swedish at school for a few years. So this tells quite interestingly about the exchange of cultural texts and ideas in the Nordic context as well. I don't know if some of you have seen Fucking Åmål. It has been, the English name is Show Me Love, which is kind of a ridiculous translation for it, but it has been, in theaters in UK, I think US as well, in smaller theaters of course. Further, the book Fittstim, it was connected to a wider phenomenon of girl-related and feminist media culture that strengthened in Sweden in the late 1990s. And I read that this vast feminist media culture was a result of at least three influences. Firstly, the Nordic model of gender equality. Secondly, Swedish New Feminism, as it was often called, which was very much influenced by academic poststructuralist feminism and queer theory, and also the Anglo-American influences of third-wave feminism, and also Riot Girl underground movement. In these magazines, guidebooks, and so on, the authors very often balanced between setting their agenda into the Swedish model of gender equality and also referencing to the US movement. So you can see this feminist mixing of cultural influences in almost all of these cultural texts. So moving to the strategies, feminist strategies present in the book. The name of the book, Fittstim, it refers to a contemporary media debate that rose in Sweden in 1992. So it was 7 years before the book was published. The media debate rose as the chairman of LO, called Stig Malm, which is the central organization of Swedish trade unions, called the Social Democratic Women's Union a damned bunch of pussies. In other words, in Swedish, ett jävla Fittstim. So this is how the editors took back the word in the preface of the collection. Perhaps he, Stig Malm, called the women a bunch of pussies because they were uncomfortable, bothersome, provocative, and because they refused to listen to the old men's rules. We only want to say thanks, Stiggan, for the word, partly because we aren't going to obey any old men's rules, partly because the word shines with will, power, and strength. So here you can see the strategy of subverting and challenging the degrading concepts, in this case, the word Fittstim. More closely about the collection, you can see the three editors there, Linda Skugge, Belinda Olsson, and Brita Silg. The book is an edited collection, including 18 short articles or columns by young feminists. The chapters introduced themes such as sexual harassment, beauty pressures, queer girlhood, gendered bullying, and girls in films. And most of the authors of the book were already well known in Swedish media publicity. They were journalists, authors, columnists, actresses, for example. And after the release of the book, the concept of media feminism became quite, it created unease in Sweden. It was accused of being too connected to the neoliberal politics and so on. So it became a concept that was very much debated about during that time. In the book, the contributors, they introduced a new, cool and strong feminist generation. They used the word girl, or in Swedish, tjej, in comparison to using woman, and aimed for feminist consciousness raising among their peers, but also among younger women and girls. And the book, it was translated into all Nordic languages, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, Finnish, and it sold in 30,000 copies, so it's quite a big number in a small country such as Sweden. Here you can see in the other quotation how the strategies of taking degrading concepts into use, challenging them, how it was discussed in the daily press as well, quite widely. Fittstim is an excellent example, Margareta Swan says. Today, no one can use the word without thinking of a group of young girls who had taken their space in the public sphere. And this was already in 1999 when the book was published, so it's created quite a lot of enthusiastic debates, but also criticism. Moving on, how this strategy of challenging degrading concepts, how it was connected to post-structuralism. Judith Butler's Gender Trouble was translated into Swedish already in 1993, and it became very much used in these publications. And also how these strategies were connected to feminist history writing, post-feminism and gender equality in the Swedish context. After finishing my PhD, my interest has more and more been on the key concepts of academic girlhood studies and how we use them while telling different kinds of stories about the feminist movement and the feminist role models. During the 1990s, Swedish feminists and those who worked in media especially, they did not use the concept of third wave or post-feminism about their movement that much. Instead, they placed their movement in the continuum of Swedish feminist history while also emphasizing the creation of a new post-structuralist and queer generation. In these cultural texts, thus, the new girl was often constructed as a break and amnesia in feminist history. She signaled the beginning of a new era. And she was also produced as a new role model for this movement. The concept of a girl in Swedish tjej was mobilized as a sign of subversion, as you can see in the first quotation. We want to show that we exist and that we care. We are cool, pretty, tough, smart, funny, and most of all, we are feminists. For me, the question of post-feminism was one of the that I struggled with quite a lot during my PhD, because I wanted to find out what it meant and what it could mean in the Swedish context. So through these next examples, I want to highlight the point how the concepts such as post-feminism, it should be rethought and put it in its historical and also cultural and political context. While one can see readings about post-feminism in popular culture in my research material, such as the notion that feminism would be undone, forgotten, and repudiated in popular culture, and feminist rhetoric would be taken over by the market, in my reading, post-feminism was more linked to an era of post-gender egalitarian thinking and post-Swedish state feminism. At the turn of the millennium, several feminist researchers, media feminists, and queer scholars, such as the authors of Fittstim and Ulrika Dahl, a queer scholar in Sweden, for example, pointed out the gaps and problems in gender egalitarian thinking. They pointed out that the gender egalitarian model is strongly focused on Swedish girls and boys, and it introduces Sweden as a norm, a kind of a gender egalitarian haven. They pointed out about the middle class focus and the heteronormative emphasis of the model. And interestingly, these media feminist authors and columnists, they pointed out that the society that was named as the most equal in 1995 had let them down when they had grown up. And so they created their generation in relation to this crisis, and they critically analyzed the need for a queer, post-structuralist and intersectional agenda. Karolina Ramqvist writes in Fittstim, "Feminism for me, a word for different kinds of thoughts that come into mind when one realizes that men and women are not equal." Another example from a contemporary feminist guidebook called Ex-Merkt. "We are daughters who have grown up as young women. They say we are becoming adults in the most equal country of the world. Many of us are unemployed. If we aren't unemployed, we are project workers or trainees. We have the same opportunities to start our career as our male peers, What separates us from them are push-up bras and shaved legs. So here you can also see the focus on criticizing the gender egalitarian model. Another concept which I referred to already earlier, that of neoliberalism. The media feminist movement and media feminism, it created lots of controversy in Sweden. We have been talking about a lot today how women who step into the public sphere, they often get a lot of criticism for doing so. And it was precisely like that in the case of Fittstim as well. It was even hostility from contemporaries. The book was accused for mobilizing the girl as a rather independent subject and for introducing feminism as a personal, individualistic choice, and about forgetting the feminist history. So what I see here is the, I think the connection to neoliberalism, it should be taken into account, of course, but it should be really sensitively analyzed. And also it would be important to lift up other explanations of the movement besides the connection to neoliberalism. For example, in Sweden, as sociologist Elina Oinas has noted, the idea of independent, strong girl child, it's not only a product of neoliberalism. Elina Oinas calls this idea of feminism Pippi Longstocking feminism, by which she refers to Astrid Lindgren's Pippi Longstocking character. And I think she has a good point there. The independency, strength that Pippi that she has, it can also be seen here as a longer historical trace. So this independency, strength, it's not only connected to the neoliberal politics or the crisis of the Swedish social democracy in the mid-1990s. So naming all this activism simply neoliberal is, for me, an oversimplification, and it doesn't make justice to the movement. So this is a quotation also already from year 1999, which I really agree with. Nevertheless, this is obviously radical politics, whether it's about the socialist Aurora of the 70s or the gang of culture and media career women of the 1990s. It still means a challenge to take your place as a woman with a voice in the public debate. In this sense, Fittstim is of course part of the women's movement, a highly political manifest. So to conclude, I think I have 1 minute or 2 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool. So to conclude, some thoughts about rewriting this feminist history and historiography of this era. Looking at these examples, the case of Fittstim seems to tell kind of a progress story, as the authors put it. They wanted to bring forth a new kind of a girl, a strong girl. The celebration of a new generation after gender egalitarian feminism, a story of strong girls. This progress story has also been voiced in Swedish academic writing about the era and the emergence of post-structuralist feminism and queer studies in Sweden by such authors as Don Kulik, Fanny Ambios, and Tina Rosenberg. For me, however, I think we have to be quite critical and pay close attention to how the girl is mobilized as a sign of difference, how the novelty is constructed. For example, the girl seems to have become in many ways the watershed between second and third wave feminisms, which leaves the continuum of feminist thinking unnoticed. In the Swedish context, the girl implied both a continuum and a historical break. She was the new, queer, sometimes rather neoliberal feminist girl, media feminist girl, but also a daughter of gender egalitarian tradition, a Pippi Longstocking feminist, and a daughter who placed herself in the continuum of feminist thinking. You can see also these examples on the pages of Fittstim. While most of the articles emphasize the creation of a new generation born to the most equal country of the world, there are some examples that bring out the history of feminist movement. For example, quotations and references to Simone de Beauvoir. Also this article by Carolina Ramqvist, Not Like the Other Mothers, about a feminist mom, which tells about her experiences of growing up as the daughter of a feminist mother and trying to figure out her agenda in between. So this is what I would like to focus on even more next, trying to find out these continuums in the recent history, recent past of feminism, trying to figure out how the waves are connected, what kind of links we see between them. And here, here I'm influenced by Carol from Diehouse, who has argued that the waves of panic, but also excitement, have characterized the creation of modern mediated girlhood. Thank you.
Could I ask the panelists to come take your seats? So since you've all been so good, we now have 10 minutes, although we started a bit late, for questions. Thanks. So any questions? Oh, yes. Go ahead.
I was just curious, Diana. First of all, I loved all the papers. Thank you very much. And Diana, I was curious if you could talk more about how you found your resources. I mean, I know you said something about eBay.
Yeah.
Are some of those archival collections
The
as well?
great majority of them are eBay. It's the wonders of people dying and their family members want to get rid of everything. And you find all of these online. Sometimes it has happened that other scholars have kept them as they collect them, like out of estate sales. And when they know that I'm doing this kind of a project, they actually volunteer them. The great majority of these sources are not going to be identified, so you're not going to know who put them together. And that creates a problem for this kind of work. So I only discussed signed, therefore we know who put them together, because when you don't, it's a mystery what to do with them. I'm still trying to work through that. Because there's amazing documents out there that you don't know who put them together, so you can't read them through gender, class, and that kind of context. But the majority of them, you're going to find them on eBay, on people's attics, estate sales, some archives. There's one, a famous one, that Richard Abel is writing about now, which is a Margaret Herrick one, but that's one. I have probably a dozen now from my personal resources. So,
And the letters too, or for sale?
the letters, I found them also like that. Yeah, like sometimes scholars keep these things as mementos, and they have great collections, and they don't donate them to municipal or institutions or research facilities, so you kind of have to go to the people. And the people will hold them. Fans, people that love these things in the 70s and start seeing value in silent film then. And many letters too you can find published. If you want to go into that territory, fan magazines, film fan magazines might have them published.
It's just fascinating. I've been trying to dig for old letters and diaries, so I was just curious to hear more about how you sort of worked your way through that.
3 years on eBay almost every week. That's it. It's hard work, I guess. But recommend it. Now I have to bid against you. Every time, I have to tell you this, every time I was having this conversation with Richard Abel, more famously, where he's like, eBay? Okay, should I do that? And I was like, no, you shouldn't. And now every time they're getting more and more expensive, I'm starting to have to buy them for $100, which I don't have, by the way, because I'm an in-between jobs, graduate. So you're kind of like, okay, please, 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 Richard Abel, do not buy these with your amazing research funds. Don't make it go up the roof. But they're getting more expensive. So don't get in there. Yeah, next time.
Any other questions? Okay, let's go that way. So first you and then.
Do I start?
Yes.
Thank you. My first question goes to the person that presented on crafting a sense of self in the age of mechanical reproduction, movie, engineering, guests and media producers 9/11 to 1990. Good. Actually, her paper is an eye-opener to me. why I say it's an eye-opener is I've been going through the papers, daily papers, weekly papers, or monthly magazines published in my country. And I discovered that lady editors, so to say, are always writing on cosmetics, nature care, pregnancy, how men are cheating their wives, how men are neglecting their wives. But it had never dawned on me that, women are not writing about politics, they are not writing about war. Rarely have I seen any woman journalist writing about Boko Haram that is ravaging Nigeria. Come on. You understand me? What I'm saying is, it dawned on me now that these women, the journalists, have a specific, as if a stereotype or recycling the way, they have a tunnel, they have a channel where they're writing, and that's their area of interest. If you want to read about cream, cosmetics, go and read the pages of women, how infidelity amongst women, go and read what, it dawned on me, I say it is true. So the question I'm asking now is, how do we encourage women journalists to now diversify, so to say, into other areas and not this stereotypical and reinventing the way of writing on men cheating women and to diverse into other current and present issues. I don't know if you understand
this question more, right?
Right. It is a really interesting question. I was struck because it resonates with what you were talking about as well, Mary, around, we're training all these young women through undergrad programs into production to work in industries that are so ruled and regulated by men. And, okay, the women I described in the 70s were successful in a way at infiltrating a male domain. But interestingly, they did it very much on their own terms. They wrote about new stuff that mattered to them and to other women they knew. And so they actually reshaped journalism in doing what they wanted to do. And I think, it's very hard to say to an undergrad, do what you think's right, go make the film you want to make. Because obviously it would be a great film if you do that, but, they're the most vulnerable, and yet we're the ones that were saying, well, go break the mold, good luck. But it's interesting, I think, to remember our history from that point and to connect these waves of feminism, because those women in the 70s, they were all in their 20s when they became editors of the women's pages in the Irish national dailies. And they revolutionised Irish journalism at the time, and Irish society more broadly. So you don't know what you're going to achieve till you get in there and did it. There was nobody more shocked than them, by the way. They didn't have that as some sort of master plan. They just sort of stumbled in and out of this stuff, but it made massive social change and massive change to the industry. So I think sometimes we have to be careful about not trying to play by the old men's rules and actually reinvent our own rules.
And then,
okay.
sorry, it's Jen first. Yeah, okay, so you first, and then Jennifer, yes.
Okay, wonderful. This was another great panel. I so enjoyed it. And I had a question for you. It's almost, this story is just so interesting, and towards the end when you were and the columns kind of ended, was decided by the male editors who had allowed these columns into being, that all of a sudden the work is done. It sort of seems like, I couldn't believe it. And I just wondered if you could say a little more about, because it resonated with me in terms of that discourse of post-feminism, right? That the work is done, we all can wipe our hands of it and move on. So I just wondered if you could say a little more about, what was the justification given, or was justification even given for the work being done, and then how did the women feel about that? Did you ask them more about that in terms of affect or emotional responses after doing so much?
It's funny because what you're describing is what led me into this. It's really interesting in your work, in Rosalind's work, in your swimmer, and this notion around post-feminism, neoliberalism as a subjectivity. I thought, well, it wasn't always thus, so if we map back, how does a feminist subjectivity shape the work and the content? So that was actually the starting point. I'm not sure I've answered it. Just at that practical level, No, basically Donald Foley. What happened, I guess, was that the women and the content of the women's pages kind of seeped out into the newspapers more broadly. A lot of the women did go on, unlike the situation you're describing in Nigeria, they went on to write about economics, politics. Nan McCafferty would be one of the best-known journalists writing on Northern Ireland. Mary Holland would have been part of that grouping as well. She wrote there in and out of the Observer as well. So there's a whole group of them, and these are really the first three, and I want to talk to the rest of them. But so they moved out into the paper more broadly. So I think Donald Foley felt there wasn't a need anymore for a women's page. The feminist movement of the early 70s had achieved quite radical change in a very short, like they only lasted for a year, and yet they managed to change legislation into, Mary Robinson would have been involved in around the edges of that movement as well, gave them lots of legal advice. So they had started a very strong feminist movement in Irish society. There was certain amounts of infighting that just got problematic, and so the movement itself kind of collapsed, but they had achieved so much. And I think it was a sense that they had achieved the potential for broader dissemination, that they didn't need that women's page anymore. So I think, funnily, what led Donald Foley into it, capturing the wave of a change and the notion that young feminist women would, who wanted to change the world, would sell newspapers, he had now had his eye to the next thing, whatever that was.
Can I just add a backup question to that, which is how fast did the paper, did that paper decline back into a kind of typical model of papers, or has it stayed kind of significantly better off in terms of representation of women, both in terms of the stories of women, but also the number of women?
It didn't lose any of those women journalists. They all remained at the paper, but just not writing specifically for the women's pages. They moved on into writing about other things, and Mary Marr stayed there till she retired, as far as I know. Mary Kenny came to London and didn't fare so well there. Mary Kenny had a lot of women working for her in Dublin, and she was fantastic to work for, apparently. But when she came to the UK, I think she found the male bastion of it harder to deal with. She was very flamboyant. She was mad as a brush, but really good fun, real character. But then she kind of had her own personal trajectory around it all, and then she became quite conservative after she married, had 2 kids. She kind of found God, and there's a lot of kind of sense of betrayal in the Irish feminist movement around that particular story, because she was so much their symbolic leader.
Right. So it was, the people were still there, but the stories changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no one was necessarily
like there was funny things happened, and like a lot of the women in the Irish women's liberation movement said, we never thought to put divorce on the agenda because we just never thought of it. We didn't think that was kind of beyond the bounds of possibility. And so that would have come up then later in the abortion stories, and now Kitty Holland would write a lot on that issue in Ireland, as her mum had written previously on women's liberation as well. So it morphed and it changed, and that's what I want to track. So I'm not there yet. I'll get back to you all.
Jennifer.
This it kind of is congealing a little bit around the question that I have, so it might be somewhat repetitive. If that's the case, we can move on. But this is, I think, more in conjunction with Anne's piece, but I think all of the projects speak to this. I'm wondering about sort of this tension between what seems to be very personalized issues of what seem to be like happenstance or circumstance, or like these women kind of come into these jobs, versus the kind of, I think, more of the American model in the 1970s, where there's structural openings being put in place. So for instance, like in employment practices, we had the Equal Opportunity Act. And so that's the reason why a lot of feminists then get into employment, and then they kind of like secret in their little feminist politics under the radar. And it seems like a very different idea. And so I was just wondering, I guess there's 2 maybe questions involved with this. One is there any kind of institutionalized outcome that then results from this kind of, I don't know if it's the cart or the horse now, but something coming before the other? Is there any institutionalized thing that makes it a legitimized space for then more women to come in? So that might be one way to talk about it. And then the other question might be then, is it important that they were, like, what does it mean that they're feminists? I guess that, does the feminist politics make a difference beyond content of the things they're writing about? Does it make a difference in some sort of institutionalized way, or does it just matter that they were women who were just writing really good columns, or how important is feminist politics to this story? So I think those are maybe 2 questions. Feel free to answer whichever one you want, or neither. But I just sort of speculate that these questions kind of maybe underlie some of the three projects as well, the kind of tension between personal politics, institutionalized acts, and progress and structure, and which comes first and is that important, and yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah, I can actually start by saying something about the film production, because here in film production in the early 1990s, the Swedish Film Institute started to direct financing to girl films, to female film directors, and ask for manuscripts about girl themes. So it was a conscious choice. And also several of these films, they were made for media educational purposes. So there you can definitely see how the structural changes, how they enabled this Swedish girl film way to emerge. But also it, how the structure, how it can also limit. There's one example of Teresa Fabik, who directed a girl film in 2003. It was a film about sexual harassment, and she didn't get to decide the closure of the film, because the from the film industries and Swedish Film Institute, the demand was quite strong for the girl to get revenge in the end. It was a story about sexual harassment about a 13-year-old girl. So she would have wanted to end it quite tragically to underline the severity of the topic, but since the film was aimed for media education, so she couldn't do that. So it comes from quite different, it can be seen in quite different ways in film production.
So the institutionalization of it sort of negates her feminist vision.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, in that case, yeah.
So we're out of time, but I know that you had a question for all of them, but please, continue this maybe in the pub.
Please, I have a question, please. Just an explanation, please.
Okay.
To Anne O'Brien. Please explain to me the meaning of this ditch. Here who beats Think Zebra.
Oh yeah. I think it's a phrase that's come up in the women's leadership literature a lot, and it talks about that piece about roles and the allocation of roles to women, that there's a discongruity in a woman being a journalist, because in the 70s most men were journalists. When people thought journalists, they thought man. And so what women were effectively asking people to do was to think hoofbeats, not think horse, think zebra. So to kind of shift the gendering of things. It's just a little phrase.
So what does the zebra mean now? Zebra means acting a woman's role?
Yeah.
Acting a woman's role, and
I think it's a way to describe how you can disrupt thinking, to not just think that leader equals man or journalist equals man, but that actually, just because it's really funny when you think about it.
Thank you so much.